Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Maeve Bulger. I work with Friends of the Earth Europe, the NGO. So this morning, welcome to this morning's panel debate on how do we deal with the European Green Deal. So we're organising this panel together with the European Environmental Bureau. It's for the next 1.5 hours, so we've got a good lineup of speakers. I'll let our moderator, Ricardo, say a bit more about the session in general and its aims, but from our side, the idea of this debate came about because Friends of the Earth and the EEB both work on environmental policies at the EU level. And most of these green policies are now packaged under the European Green Deal. But we also both work with very much a system change lens and aim to tackle the root causes of our environmental breakdown, which we know is our broken, growth-driven economic system. So the aim is to bring these pieces together to discuss and critique some main aspects of the European Green Deal, the potential constraints of EU policy for transformational change towards degrowth, and also given the current COVID pandemic and the large recession we're facing, to discuss a bit where the priority should be in the recovery. So we're going to start with some opening remarks from our moderator, Ricardo. Then it will be followed by the panel debate with our speakers, and comments and questions are welcome in the chat box. We'll also be using the polling tool, which you'll see at various points. So keep an eye on that and you can vote via the polling tool. Before we get into the introduction, just quickly on the background of who Friends of the Earth and EEB are. So Friends of the Earth Europe are a network of 32 national organisations and thousands of local groups from across Europe campaigning for sustainable and just societies and the protection of the environment. Our Brussels office works on many topics, including climate, energy, trade, food and farming, resource justice. Our director is one of the speakers today, so she'll give more insight into our thinking on these topics. And just to add that right now we're developing with the European Network our vision of a new economy, which has never been done before. So really the overarching principles that we see vital in a new economic system. So I'll hand it over to Cathy, who's from the EEB and is co-hosting, and I'll let her say a bit about the EEB and introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Maeve. Is it working? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. I'm Cathy. I work for the European Environmental Bureau. And yeah, the EEB is a large network of environmental citizens organizations in Europe. And at the moment, we have over 160 member organizations in more than 35 countries in our network. And similar to Friends of the Earth Europe, we also work on a really wide range of different topics, such as climate change, biodiversity, energy, or agriculture, but also on some overarching issues such as good governance or sustainable development in Europe and beyond. And I and my colleague, we are particularly working on economic and environmental justice while focusing on advocating on the EU level for a shift from a GDP growth-based economy basically towards a new economy that prioritizes well-being for the people and the nature. So I will leave it here now, but also, if you would like to get some more information about our work, please visit our websites, and also don't hesitate to contact us directly. And now I would like to quickly introduce our moderator and our speakers of today's panel. So our moderator for today is Ricardo, who is a PhD candidate in ecological economics and political ecology at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And in his research, he looks basically at the theory of degrowth and how this can offer an effective pathway for climate stabilization. Then we have Dr. Tone Smith, who is an educated social geographer from the University of Oslo. And she also holds a doctorate from the University of Vienna in social and economic science. She writes and researches about ecological economics and degrowth, and she's also more generally interested in the overarching themes and in the intersection of environment and economics. As Maeve has mentioned before, Jagoda Munich is the director of Friends of the Earth Europe. She's also a former chair of Friends of the Earth International, and before that she has been also the president of Friends of the Earth Croatia for several years. Then we also have Pablo Magana here, who is an activist based in Berlin. He co-founded and coordinates the Green New Deal for Europe campaign, and he's also a member, amongst others, of the coordinating collective of the Democracy in Europe movement. And then we were also supposed to have here today Aurore Laluc, which is a member of the European Parliament as part of the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. And she's also chairwoman of the intergroup on the Green New Deal. Unfortunately, we just got the news that she might not make it today. So maybe she will manage to send a video, but yeah, unfortunately, she will not be present. Yeah, so that's it from my side. So I will hand over to Ricardo now, and yeah, welcome everyone again.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Kathy. And good day, everyone. I'm honored to be asked to moderate this panel debate on the topics of the Green New Deal, the European Green Deal, and degrowth, and how they interact with all our amazing speakers. And in my opening remarks, I'd like to share with you some of the thinking that I've been doing on these topics as part of my PhD research, and hopefully this can set the scene for the discussion to follow. So I'll start off by saying that the term Green New Deal was coined by climate justice movements in the US in 2018 in a reference to Roosevelt's New Deal, which was a series of social programs, public work projects, and financial reforms and labor regulations enacted in the aftermath of the Great Depression. In a similar vein, the Green New Deal is a policy platform aiming at pairing labor and social programs with climate change mitigation measures. The Green New Deal therefore prescribes the need for an active role of the state in the economy, and in doing so, we should heed Keynes' famous advice, and I quote, "The important thing for government is not to do things which individuals are doing already, and to do them a little better or a little worse, but rather to do those things which at present are not done at all," unquote. This means fully deploying the power of public investment and coordination in a historic break from the neoliberal dogma that has reigned over for the past 30 years. After all, clean energy and the low carbon infrastructure necessary to provide it is a public good. Historically, governments have directly provided public goods, such as healthcare, roads, the sewage system. And in all these cases, governments do not incentivize private firms to build them, but rather they build them themselves or contract with firms to build them. But in either case, it is government that specs the system, procures its various elements, coordinates constructions and operations, and finances all this directly from the public purse. Treating the climate crisis as a public infrastructure challenge rather than a private market failure brings a range of advantages that pricing and regulation cannot provide. It enables long-time horizons that private investors are unlikely to tolerate. It enables planning and coordination across sectors of the economy to integrate infrastructure and institutions. And it enables low-cost public finance that could make the price of the energy transition far more manageable. Beyond all these considerations, Green New Deal advocates also take the view that the ecological crisis is part of a wider social crisis caused by unbridled capitalism. Hence, we should aim to solve it not through market mechanisms, but rather by redistributing economic and political power. The Green New Deal discourse operates by constantly delivering and broadcasting tangible quality of life improvements. This mostly by expanding the welfare state, decommodifying basic services, reducing inequality, and deepening economic democracy. In doing so, the Green New Deal could gather a winning political coalition. But while climate justice movements call for a Green New Deal, the European Commission offers us a European Green Deal. This subtle linguistic omission is not an accident. Indeed, there is little new about this climate plan, as it does not challenge the European Union's neoliberal foundations, meaning free market, free trade, endless growth, and austerity. For instance, while the European Green Deal's stated aim is to mobilize 1 trillion euros over the next 10 years for strategic investments, what this public money will actually be used for is to guarantee private investments. In essence, the goal is de-risking private investments in an effort to seduce capital to participate in the decarbonization process. In other words, the European Green Deal is a privatization scheme. It aims to enclose the opportunities afforded by the green transition in service of private capital accumulation, rather than exploiting them to expand public ownership and democratic control. But let's take a closer look at the 1 trillion figure tossed around by the European Commission. Over a 10-year period, this boils down to 100 billion per year. But only 64 billion are supposed to come from the European Union budget. And most of this money is actually just reshuffled from existing programs. Hence, member states would then be asked to make up for the gap in funding. But given the deflationary straitjacket of the Stability and Growth Pact, countries could find themselves in the situation of having to cut spending on welfare programs to finance the green transition. This blatantly runs against everything that a Green New Deal should stand for. I think that these brief considerations on the European Green Deal are enough to show that there is considerable work left to do for academics, politicians, and activists in Europe to articulate a proper Green New Deal discourse in the continent. This leads me to make some considerations on the organizing needed for this to happen. So let's look back once again at the historical precedent of Roosevelt's New Deal. While many celebrate his administration as a visionary one, the New Deal was not the result of Roosevelt's concerns over economic and social costs of the Great Depression, but rather it was political pressure that forced the US president to begin experimenting with programs responsive to the concerns of working people. The point I want to make is that, like its namesake before it, the Green New Deal will inevitably be a social compromise, in the sense that it will be a product of and a response to class struggle. Decades of environmentally conscious class struggle have brought us here. Decades more will be needed to get us to where we need to be. In the meantime, we need to be able to hold two contradictory thoughts in our heads at once. First, that as the most promising piece of social and environmental legislation, the Green New Deal is worth fighting for. Second, that should it be watered down the way that the European Green Deal has been, for instance, it might just result in new rounds of primitive accumulation and the further commodification of nature. The goal of climate justice and degrowth activists should then be to push the Green New Deal proposals and the excitement surrounding them in a radical direction. And this is surely something that the degrowth community can contribute to. For example, by pointing out that to date, all new renewable energy production covers only a small fraction of growing energy demand. Economic growth makes emission reductions chase an ever-receding target of perpetually increasing energy consumption. We should also denounce a myopic carbon accounting that stops at our borders, invisibilizing the vast global networks of extraction, production, and distribution that a massive transition to renewable energy in the European Union would require. If we don't do this, the result may be green social democracy at home and neo-colonial land grabs abroad. But for all this to happen, we must first of all question the totem of endless economic growth. Ultimately, there is nothing natural about GDP growth. The economy is a social construction, and we can, therefore, deconstruct it. These insights are in line with what the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us. When confronted with a major crisis, we must stop activities that threaten well-being, regardless of the impact that this will have on economic growth. Once we have established a safe limit for human well-being, be it stay at home to ensure physical distancing or limit global heating to 1.5 degrees to ensure climate stability, then the task is to reshape the economy to function within these limits. This is, in my opinion, the greatest contribution that degrowth research and activism can bring to the debate around the Green New Deal. With these considerations, I close my opening remarks and let us commence the panel debate. And so I turn to our speakers to hear their takes on the Green New Deal and related topics. They have 5 minutes each for their opening remarks, and then we will take questions from the audience and we'll start the proper debate. So without further ado, I give the floor to Jagoda.
Hello. I hope you can hear me. Good day. Firstly, thanks for invitation. I'm looking forward to a debate on the issue with you, and also look forward to have to participate in the Degrowth conference. Unfortunately, now it's online. As Maeve already introduced me, I'm director of Precedent Europe via network with more than 30 member groups in Europe, and as a part of Global Friends of the International Network, which has many groups in Global South too. I must say that in terms of like European Green Deal, that we don't have campaign on Green Deal. So this is not how we started. We did start a long time ago to debate like what does it mean to live in a sustainable and just society. And therefore we developed some kind of guiding principle for system change. So this was kind of like our background. Now we know that there is a proposal of European Green Deal, and I would like to start maybe with positive. If you put it in the context, the last year, before elections, we were campaigning to prioritize sustainability and justice as one of topics on the agenda for Parliament, Commission, and the Council. And in a way, we were quite surprised that this is the first kind of priority in the new Commission. When you look at the context of the elections last year, it was very big fear that we will have even more right-wing people in the Parliament and that this agenda will completely drop off from the table. But Fridays for Future movement, climate movement in general, I think helped that this topic is now on the agenda of the Commission. So this is good news, of course. And in a way, it is a changer in the mainstream politics on a global scale. So this is something that we think is good opportunity. Of course, there is danger. The first danger is that it's going to be very corporate capture, greenwash PR that will serve big industry economic growth. And indeed, when you look how the framing is of European Green Deal, it does serve to new growth wave, and it is in a way excuse for new cycle of global capitalism. In a way, when you look at it, it's like that. You can see that the European Green Deal maybe is not much more than green economy that's already now forgotten, and that was presented some years ago in 2012. So we are a bit afraid that it might end up in that direction. So when the package was published in December, we were very critical of it. We thought it's not ambitious enough. It needs to be built on solidarity and justice, and it's not. It has to tackle consumption and growth, which it didn't. In fact, it was used as a service to growth. So in a way, Commission is presenting European Green Deal as a basis for the new growth. And that's its fundamental flaw. Then we decided to use our system change guidance and principles that we can see how we can analyze what they propose and have critique from that perspective. And we had like 5 principles for transformation that we identified, and on basis of which we have looked at the policies proposed in European Green Deal and judged them in a way. And then we also proposed alternative. And I think Maeve already has shared this publication in the chat box, so you can have a look there. And these 5 principles are: first, urgency and scale. Maybe from the mainstream perspective, European Green Deal looks like some big change, and maybe in mainstream it is, but in terms of what's needed, it's not enough, because we have very few years actually to have radical change in how society functions and how economy functions. And to meet the scale and urgency of climate change and transformation needed. So in that regard, this is not ambitious enough. We need policies that deliver results within the lifetime of the Commission. So also postponing policies to 2050 or 2030, it's far too far in future, and we need to have something concrete now in the next 5 years, and we can in a way keep them accountable for that. So this is first thing. We need something that is binding and enforceable, not just voluntary goals. So this is the first problem. The second problem is that we need economy. We need to reimagine our economy that is within Earth limits. And of course, it serves for meeting the needs of the people. So no more market mechanisms which are proposed. We need to have effective measures to cap overall demand and consumption for energy, resources, and products. So this is fundamental change that is not there and is directly linked with the regrowth. The third one is equity. It has to be based on solidarity between the countries in Europe, but also globally, between regions and different sectors of society and frontline communities. So we need to see who benefits from this. And fourth one is that we need to have people, solutions, and participation. So it has to be under democratic control, has to be transparent in preparation of policy and implementation, and it has to be for the benefits of the people, has to promote also local solutions, which it doesn't not. The fifth one is the global justice, and that means that how Europe is actually placed in relation to others. Firstly, we don't see that conditionalities that they said in terms of they will do something like more ambitions if others are doing. This is not good enough. We have to have priorities set based on fair shares towards global south, and Europe should take leadership in that. And in terms of transition, it's really important that the burden is not on the global south in terms of providing materials and resources, and that Europe is actually kind of moving into new level of developing new technologies without considering its impact on the global south. I think I will stop here as a general introduction. I wanted to focus on much more what we have done, and We also, of course, analyze European Green Deal different policies in more details. And we also looked at how now, with the impact of Corona crisis and recovery package, it will go, the Green Deal is going to develop. In that regard, our estimation is that in the next years, it will be really important how we develop narrative on economic solutions that are kind of alternative narrative to neoliberal solutions to the crisis. That means based on solidarity, based on justice, and for the benefit for everybody without privatization of all services, as I think Ricardo already expressed very well in the introductory remark. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Jagoda. And there are already some questions here in the chat, and people have been asking how they can access the report by Friends of the Earth Europe that you mentioned, and it's being posted now in the chat, so I recommend everybody to go and take a look at it. And now I give the floor to Pablo.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Pablo. I'm the co-founder and coordinator of the campaign for the Green New Deal for Europe, which is a coalition that was originally convened by the Democracy in Europe movement of think tanks, of activists, of labor unionists, of researchers and others, who came together to really try to define a model of the green transition that delivers on the promise of climate justice. And so we've been paying very close attention to whatever's been coming out of the European Commission. Ricardo already talked about the curious semantics of the Green Deal, the omission of the new, the cutting out of Roosevelt from the program. But the politics are equally interesting. When you look at the Green Deal, at least in rhetoric, it emerged in the wake of Europe's Green Wave in the last parliamentary elections, where millions were marching in the streets to demand systemic change and action on the climate. And when you contrast the rhetorical promise of the Green Deal on the one hand, with its bold language of the moonshot that Ursula von der Leyen has appropriated from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, with, on the other hand, its deeply lazy policy agenda, one conclusion to me is inescapable, which is that the Green Deal is history's most ambitious exercise in greenwashing. It's an attempt to absorb the demands and the momentum of the climate movement, to co-opt their anger and their kind of expectations in rhetoric, while stripping them of all of their substance. And so to answer the question of, what do we do with the Green Deal? In our view, rather than celebrate the marginal improvements that are on the table, that the Commission has framed for us, we should see this program for what it is. It's a slap in the face to all the people who have been demanding systemic change, and it's a clear challenge to the climate movement. It's the establishment saying as clearly as it possibly can, we are not up to the task. The ball is now in your court. And as Ricardo hinted earlier, the thing to remember about the original New Deal, from which the Green New Deal draws its name and the Green Deal attempts to steal legitimacy, is that it wasn't constructed in 100 days by a slick technocrat from a scrap heap of pre-existing policies, which the Green Deal effectively is. It was won by militant labor organizing and grassroots groups who are suffering under a historic economic depression, who said enough is enough. And they organized and they marched and they shut down production lines. And eventually, through that organizing, their demands were met. But you know what? The victory that they won wasn't enough. The social democratic settlement that the New Deal ushered in persisted, maybe 30, 40 years. And its dismantling under neoliberalism brought about an era of brutal, of violent economic dispossession that set us on a path where some scientists are seriously talking about the idea that human civilization might no longer be viable within our lifetimes. This is serious. This is something that has no historical precedent. And that's in the global north, whose prosperity was constructed on the backs and from the bones of people on the global south. And that's not a legacy that we should be trying to rebuild. So the Rooseveltian model, which the Green Deal of the Commission is so far away from, is still in itself insufficient for the task ahead. So it's in this context that we have to, I think, assess the Commission's proposals. It's a policy program that very clearly fails to live up to the challenge ahead, as Ricardo already said, in Jagoda. It is fundamentally a privatization scheme. It is a tool to siphon public wealth into private hands. It does nothing in the midst of a democratic crisis and a crisis of democratic legitimacy in Europe to deepen the politics and engage citizens and communities in the process of transition. In the midst of an economic crisis, it does nothing to bring relief to the over 100 million people who already before the pandemic were at risk of poverty or social exclusion by the European Commission's own account. And in the midst of a climate crisis, it's committing to distant decarbonization targets that are already slipping while pursuing a politics of active climate and environmental destruction. I mean, just today, a new coal plant was opened in Germany. And that tells you something about the organizing that we've been doing also, and the fact that we haven't become a serious enough threat to the political establishment to push through an agenda that is actually going to do what's necessary. So to answer the question, how do we respond to the Green Deal? I think we respond by not engaging with it, because when we engage with it, we grant it legitimacy. And this is not a program that in my eyes deserves legitimacy. But we respond to it by building real political power, by organizing, and then by constructing and envisioning alternatives, and then fighting to show that those alternatives are not only possible, not only necessary, but also deeply desirable, and can create societies that are much more stable, that are much more democratic, that are much more prosperous, and that are much more sustainable over the long term than the society that we have today. And I think that has to be the mission of anyone working on the climate agenda today. So I think I'll wrap it up with that, and we can open it up to discussion. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Powell. And somebody in the chat noted your wording of history greatest exercise in greenwashing as a very good label for it, and that makes it a great tweet. So whoever is the fastest to send it out as a tweet, I think they will get quite a bit of attention today. So let's move on to Tone, who will bring a more, let's say, degrowth-oriented perspective to the debate before we move on to the Q&A part of our debate. Tone, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for organizing this panel. I think the topic is very timely. I will, as a degrowth activist and ecological economist, I will mirror some of the concerns and points that Ricardo mentioned initially, but go maybe a bit more into a critique. And as I expected, so my co-panelist also would have already presented a critique of the EU Green Deal before it was my time to speak. So yeah, and I agree, of course, on many of the issues raised. Although I think I also want to mention what Uli Brand said yesterday in the opening panel of the conference, that we have to realize that the EU Green Deal has come about because there is a pressure in Europe for social ecological transformation that they cannot overlook at the central level of the Commission and political level. Still, of course, the Green Deal uses language as suggesting a deep transformation, which is clearly not what this deal is about. I would say just highlight the kind of framing that the deal uses, very much ecological modernization language, which buzzwords such as efficiency, decoupling, circular economy, competition, of course, clean energy instead of renewable energy, natural capital instead of highlighting our relationships to nature. It's all about the utility of nature to us, for our well-being and so on. Restoration of nature in the recently published part of the EU Green Deal on biodiversity is closely linked to finance, and I think this is an issue which is important to be aware of: offsetting and innovative finance. Frederick Hush at the Green Finance Observatory has written really interesting things about this. Also, the net emission concept, which is very much about offsetting and negative emissions technologies. All these things are problematic not only from a degrowth perspective, but also from a general sustainable development perspective. So it's not only a project of austerity, but also a project of growth, of course, which is explicit. And I think, so that is a clear difference between the EU Green Deal and the various Green New Deal projects around. Green New Deal projects. Of course, there are many different, but in general, they are clearly more radical, especially on the social side, with respect to justice, basic services, and so on. And of course, it depends on which ones you study. But for example, if we look at the American Democrat ones or the UK Labour Green Deal, they don't mention growth as an explicit goal, which I think is interesting. At the same time, I have done a kind of very brief overview where I think it's easy to realize that some basic core elements of degrowth are still missing across the line of these new Green Deal suggestions. And so I just want to list them, since I have only 5 minutes here for the beginning. We can go into details later, maybe. So there is a critique of the growth society as such, the imaginary of growth, I would say. There is also a critique of missing a critique of the growth dependency, which is part of capitalism. There is no critique of the consumer society as such. There is also no critique of average consumption levels in the global north related to like a modern lifestyle. And also little mention, despite being focused on social justice, little mention of how consumption levels in the global north, I mean average consumption levels, are happening, especially on the back of marginalized group in the global south, what Ulrich Brandt has also labeled the imperial mode of living. There are missing suggestions to cap production levels and extraction levels. And maybe this is the clearest break, I think, with some of the degrowth literature, is that Green New Deal proposals, even the recent one from DiEM25, is really lacking a debate on the meaning and focus on work. So there's very much the focus on job guarantee, the right to work, but what about the fact that jobs are necessary to make a livelihood? This is one of the core degrowth critiques, and I think this is really missing across the spectrum of various Green New Deal projects. Then, of course, with the reference to the old New Deal all the time, it is hard to not feel that Green New Deal is, after all, also close to a green growth project with its social profile, but really boosting the demand side of the economy. So in some ways, people have said it's a project to save capitalism, and many of the degrowth proposals obviously goes beyond capitalism. Now, I think probably Green New Deal adherents have different goals with formulating such a project as the Green New Deal. Some aim to reform capitalism, some to go beyond it, ultimately. But this project is getting really a lot of attention today, and it's what I think is sad is then we miss the opportunity then to discuss many of the core aspects of degrowth. So I actually believe that instead of discussing whether we can have a Green New Deal without growth, we, the degrowthers, need to play the role of clearly stating core requirements of a degrowth society, which goes far beyond what is yet proposed in any Green New Deal project that I have seen so far. Thank you, and looking forward to the debate.
All right. Thank you very much, Tone, for bringing a more, let's say, degrowth-specific perspective to our debate. And at this point of the panel, we were supposed to hear from Aurore Laluca, who is a member of the European Parliament, but unfortunately she cannot make it. She's stuck in traffic. And that's a real pity, because I think it would have been very important to have her voice in this debate, because we were trying to bring together activists, academics, and politicians. And now I feel like that one tenet of the society, of all the activists and decision makers who should shape the discourse is missing. Hopefully we'll be able to have a video recording from her before the end of the section, and maybe that will give us some insights. But for the time being, let's move on to the specifics of the debate. And so I'll try to pick up some questions from the chat box. So please, everybody, I encourage everybody to type their questions, because this will make our debate much more interesting and relevant for all of you. I'll start with something that was asked concerning the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities, a report that has been published in March this year, and whose goal was to basically label plans that can be considered in line with the European Green Deal, and that can attract investments that are legitimate to invest in from the perspective of the European Green Deal. However, what is happening now with the recovery plan is that there is lots of money that is going to be spent trying to revive the economy in the EU, and some of it might end up being a lifeline for fossil fuels and other polluting sectors. So we are already seeing governments pumping billions into airlines and car makers with no real green strings attached. And this is, I think, something crucial that we mobilize in order to prevent this from happening. So I like to ask Jagoda her thinking around this, and what she thinks are some of the strategic choices we need to make for preventing this from happening.
Okay, I'll try. On maybe first question on taxonomy. I have to apologize, we are not working on taxonomy, so I'm not expert for that, but to my knowledge, this is still proposal. We don't know how it's going to end in implementation, and although in the recovery package on actually Wednesday, when Commission announced it, they said it will be conditional for investment in recovery package. It will not be applicable probably for next couple of years. So that means then in this short term, there are going to be investments quite a lot, which not much conditionality. So this is something that we still have to pay close attention in how this policy further develop and how it's going to be implemented. So that's my first. The second on the package, we actually were quite critical. We issued on Wednesday quite critical observation on the package with no conditionalities, and even Timmermans responded like, "Oh, that it's not true. It will be conditionalities." But we see there are some. Obviously, the communication itself that was published on Wednesday was much better than we expected, but it was communication. They really mastered these communications so well, you know, they say everything we want to hear. And then when you go into details, then you find out problems. So for instance, that hydrogen is completely on the same foot with renewables in terms of investment and priority, and there is no distinction, the origin of hydrogen. So there is another probably loophole in which gas industry will get lots of funding. That's one. Then in terms of, there is not much new in agriculture in terms of changes, structural changes in agriculture. And then when you look and compare the package, communication of the package, and then budget, and how budget has been reshuffled, there are, again, more worrying signs. One is that, for instance, life package is now, they propose less than in the previous proposal. And at the same time, they say, we know we have very ambitious biodiversity strategy. We want to tackle the ecosystem collapse and biodiversity loss. And where is the money for that? horizon also is going to shrink, and that will be moved to health research. So that's worrying signs. Then in terms of debt versus, like bonds, issuing bonds and debting and grants, I think that was big debate basically around it. And in the way that was compromise solution, but like how this debt is going to be redistributed and repaid. So something to follow up. So there will be lots of follow-up policies in next weeks. And I think in next weeks, there are still opportunities to, if not make this package very, very good, at least to make it not bad, because industry is lobbying and they will lobby for bailouts. Automobile industry will lobby for bailouts. We know that aviation industry is going to lobby for bailouts. So there has to be some restrictions how this money is spent and who benefits. They mentioned some social kind of elements into that, like, in renovation wave. And but again, I mean, if people will have to go into debt and mortgage for actually retrofitting their houses, what does it mean? They might lose their house if they cannot repay it later. So there are many, many things that we have to watch out in the next weeks to prevent more damage and corporate capture of it. I hope I answered the most of the cases. We also try to identify some of the kind of conditions for bailouts, which is in one of those papers that are shared. So you can have a look there and you can ask us questions in more details maybe later. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Jagoda. Yeah, very interesting. And I'd like now to pose a question to Powell and pick up on a point that he raised during his opening remarks. He stirred up the question of whether we should engage or not with the European Green Deal as it stands. And I think that this kind of question can be somehow extended now also to the recovery plan. So the risk is, as he rightly pointed out, to legitimize it. If we engage with it and we accept it as, let's say, as the only game in town, and somehow we need just now, to push it in a more progressive direction. But on the other hand, I think somebody might argue that there is a path dependency in institutions, and in the moment in which they are set up to produce these big ambitious plans, it's very hard now to reverse course, and somehow the ball is rolling and all we can do is trying to steer its direction. So I wanted to hear some of his thinking around the strategizing and how we can engage with the situation as it stands now, be for the European Green Deal or the recovery plan, and the two things combined.
Yeah, thank you for that. So a good, I think, analogy is the emissions trading scheme, which sucked up like 30 years of diplomacy and efforts and turned out to be a complete waste of time. But at the same time, because so much effort and energy went into negotiating the outcomes of that and that whole program, there was no capacity left within the institutions kind of that are responsible for policymaking in this area and within the kind of national climate agendas of European countries to come up with something better. And I think the Green Deal is of a similar genre. It is sucking up a huge amount of energy and attention by the entire European Commission on something that is not only not radical enough and doesn't deliver on the demands of climate justice, but is also quite likely set up to fail. If you look at the way that the politics of it have been structured, one example is the fact that Frans Timmermans has been appointed to lead the Green Deal portfolio, but all of the substantive financing components of the Green Deal program fall under a different portfolio called An Economy That Works for the People, which is led by the famous Austerian Valdis Dombrovskis. So anything that happens on the Green Deal has to go through the desk of basically a radical neoliberal conservative. So the political setup of this program, the institutional setup of this program, just isn't going to work, and it's not going to deliver the changes we need. So I don't buy that argument. The question then follows: what can we do? What is there left to do? I don't have much hope in the reformability of EU institutions, but one of the beautiful things that the coronavirus has exposed is the blatant lie of the assertion by governments that their hands are tied and that they're powerless and that they can't do anything because it's all in the hands of the market, right? When something happens, when there's a crisis, when a government wants to act, they can mobilize huge resources. They can mobilize huge amounts of money. They can shut down an entire country within a week. They can provide healthcare and welfare to people if they want to and if they decide to do so. And that's exactly the same case with the climate. And so I think one of the really, if we're talking really tactically about next steps, one of the things we can do is look at those beacons of hope around Europe, municipal governments like Barcelona, which are and Amsterdam, and Valencia, and Precedent in the United Kingdom, which are doing radical things around the climate, around public procurement, about trying to unwind some of those processes of neoliberalism that have kind of eroded their welfare state and their social security over the past few decades, and think of ways to push greater radicalism on them by organizing on the ground, and then trying to link up those activities, creating some kind of structure of mutual support, mutual solidarity at the municipal level to demonstrate that within the European Union, a Green New Deal that answers the challenge of the just transition is possible and is working for the benefit of ordinary people. And I don't believe for a moment that the Commission is going to do that, however much energy we spend pushing its program in the right direction. But I think there are places where we can direct our energies that will at least have that kind of signaling effect to people that there are alternatives on the table, and those alternatives aren't utopian or fantastical, but in fact deeply pragmatic.
All right, thanks a lot, Paul, for your thoughts on this matter. And this brings me to the poll that we had just closed, where we asked, how do you feel about the direction of the European Green Deal is developing towards? And 76% of the people answer it's a start, but needs a complete overhaul to make a real transformation, whereas only 23% have responded it's a lost cause. So it seems that there is in our audience a certain tendency towards trying to engage with it and trying to push it towards a more transformative direction. This is something we can go back to later on, but now I would like to pose a question to Tone based on her opening remarks and also picking up on one question that was asked from the audience. So Tone, you emphasized the missing labor dimension in Green New Deal plans. And so from our audience, a question was asked saying, how can we fight to build alliances between labor and environmental movements for on demands for an adequate Green New Deal?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Of course, I think building or referring to what I said about the need to rethink work makes the very necessary alliance with the labor movement difficult, because the labor movement has traditionally been built so much exactly on the modernist idealization to some extent of working. So I think, although I think it is really key to build alliance with the labor or trade unions, this is really where the key difficulty lies. And but maybe just starting the debate about rethinking work is already a first step to go, because it's not a debate very much out there. Last week there was also a manifesto, an open letter signed by lots of important international professors like Thomas Piketty and Nancy Fraser and James Galbraith and more, about the need to democratize work and to democratize the working place. It was published in many big newspapers. And they do not raise this issue, so it's really not really out there in the debate. Luckily, some of the people in this conference have tried to raise the issue and got an article into Le Monde in France. I'm sure some of them are present and can post it, a link to that article. But this is really an important debate. So I think that would be the first step, and I think it's really necessary to link up with the labor movement on that one. And if I could just say one thing about the question that was posed earlier about the taxonomy of sustainable activities, because it linked to something I said initially. I was referring to the work of Friedrich Hasch, and he points out very clearly that the taxonomy of the EU Green Deal has a lot of problematic activities listed in it. So this could at least be a very practical thing to push for, whether one believes what everyone voted in that poll. Of course, one could say we should really just regulate economic activities, then we would not have any unsustainable business. But the taxonomy proposal is there, at least work to get out some of the worst financial instruments like non-life insurances or catastrophe bonds, but there are also other green brown industries who has found a way in there, and the offsetting issue is also really risky in this scheme. So I just wanted to add that.
Right, thanks a lot, Tone. Yes, and I would like to go back with you again, but later on the topic of which degrowth policies you think would particularly suit a Green New Deal agenda. So you're talking about, for example, rethinking work, but there are others. So maybe just make a mental note for that, and we can go back on that at the next round of questions. And I would like instead to ask Jagoda for her opinion on a question that we received from the audience, asking, so do you think a more direct democratic system within the EU would have resulted in a better, more radical, more binding Green New Deal legislation? So this points at the democratic deficit of the European Union, and given the work that Friends of the Earth does in Brussels, we are particularly interested in hearing your take on this.
Thanks, I appreciate the question, but I don't know. I mean, would this really lead to more radical policy or less radical? Because we don't know how majority, let's say, population in Europe would vote if that something is on for voting. I just maybe want to say that the European Union is very much criticized for lack of democratic deficit. I'm not expert on the issue at all, but very often we attack in Commission or in Parliament, mostly Commission, but we forgot about Council. The most conservative element in decision making is Council, and these are national governments. They reflect also national legislation, voting system in the national level. So I think we have a lot of homework to do on grassroots level and national level to impact European Union. I'm Croatian. I moved to Brussels a few years ago, but when I look at European Union kind of policy and in comparison to national policy in a country like Croatia, European Union policies are much more advanced. So, you know, like we have a lot of work out of Brussels, not necessarily in the Brussels to increase that more. I think people are ready for change. I think people understand there is this system doesn't work for most of them. It doesn't work for nature. They see collapse of nature. They see already impacts of climate change. It's right time now for change. The problem is, I would say, that between this big vision of better world and concrete policies, there is a bit gap of providing alternative, as Pablo say, I think practical solutions that have to be there in public debate. People have to understand them. They have to see them. We have to provide that, because otherwise there are going to be just neoliberal solutions, and we still in this kind of believe there is no alternative for last 30 years. There is no alternative to neoliberalism. I think there is not one alternative, there are more than one alternative. We have to name it, we have to frame it, and we have to share it and develop it through public process and democratization. I think people, if they would see that there is alternative that is feasible, they will go for it.
All right, thanks, Jagoda. And well, trying to pick up on some aspects of your reflection on democracy and participation and voters' role in the transformation. This, I think, lead me to the next question, picking up on something that was asked in the chat box, and it was actually addressed to Tone. And but I would like to pose it first to Powell and then also hear Tone's take on it, because I think it is particularly relevant to the work that the Green New Deal for Europe platform is doing, and it's something also that Powell already mentioned in his opening remarks. And the question that was posed from the audience is, could we focus more on municipal or regional level examples that carry seeds of transformation and that can be scaled up? So I would be curious to hear your take on the dimension of this part of the strategy for a Green New Deal.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. So I think there are a few reasons why focusing on the municipal level right now is tactically, I think, sounder than focusing at the European level. First of all, municipal governments, as I said earlier, are already doing quite bold work in this area, not just in Europe, but all around the world. There's the C40 Mayors Initiative, which is kind of a global network of municipalities that are pushing for more radical action on the climate. You've got a number of cities around Europe doing that. But also municipal governments are much more immediately reactive to the demands of their constituencies. So, there's a question, if you want to oppose the agenda of the European Commission, where do you go? Who do you protest? How do you occupy someone's office? Can you even get in the building? Is that person even responsible? It's very difficult to find those levers of power where you can exercise, collective bargaining rights or collective power or whatever to undermine the agenda and to push through something else. The European Union is a very kind of closed institution. It's not very transparent, and it's very difficult for activists to have an effect on its decision making. Whereas at a municipal level, you can have a much more immediate impact on that. So I think the first step in many places would be to push municipal governments as far as they can possibly go. And I don't mean by organizing protests and holding placards, although that's also important, but by really, really seriously thinking about grassroots power. So doing strikes, closing down production, refusing to go back to work after the pandemic. The coronavirus is such an important historical moment, but it's also so full of contradictions, right? On one hand, it's opened up all of these new or revitalized all of these old structures of solidarity, of community solidarity, worker solidarity. On the other hand, it's shut down any possibility for organizing, because organizing demands physical closeness, and we're in a regime of physical distancing. On one hand, it's completely blown open the Overton window of what's politically possible, but on the other hand, we see that governments everywhere are responding by trying to double down on the status quo ante, by issuing massive bailouts to the banks, to the fossil fuel companies, and so on. So I think we need to take advantage of this moment in a really tactical way. And going back to the degrowth perspective, a very obvious way we could do that is by refusing to go back to work. If on the day lockdown is lifted, everyone refuses to go back to work, and their demand is that we shorten the working week to 3 or 4 days, then it's that will happen. That policy will be implemented because we're needed at work, right? But we don't have the infrastructure of building out this kind of international solidarity in Europe. We don't have the infrastructure to build out class power. And the climate movement hasn't really been able to make those connections with organized labor and with other sources of kind of political power that can help advance these agendas. But I think the municipal level is the right place to start.
All right, thanks, Pablo, for that. And we have another poll coming up. The question is, what is the best political level to focus efforts on to achieve maximum change? A, municipal community level, B, national level, C, EU level, D, international level, or E, all of the above. So I invite everybody to cast their vote on this poll that can advance our discussion. And let me go back to tone, and I would like to give you the opportunity of commenting on this question about municipal power, since the question was originally asked to you. But in the same breath, I'll also ask you another question, which intrigues me, and that is connected to what you were saying before. You were talking about, specific degrowth policies that can be included in the Green New Deal discourse. You mentioned rethinking work, and then there was a question that came from the audience asking, to what extent do you think Green New Deal proposals should not be seen as an end in themselves, but rather as transitional tools to implement a radical social ecological transformation, for instance, towards degrowth? So if you can reflect a bit around these topics.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so they were a bit different questions. So municipal power, I think there are many studies showing there are lots of things you can do more easily, or even that more activity happens at the municipal level, because there is possibility to do things at that level today, which are not possible to the same extent at the national level. At the same time, there are international structures that we need to change if we really want to change the exploitation over the global south, and these kind of big issues is really hard to do anything about if we don't work on other levels than the municipal. So also I know there has been studies, for example, by Dan O'Neill, showing the problem with local currencies. The study was particularly on Bristol in the UK, I think, that as long as we linked to a global economy, there is unfortunately limits to what a local currency initiative can attain. So these kind of issues, and we discussed yesterday in the evening panel about the need to change institutions, and in that setting, it is clear that also the national institutions are key. So I think, yeah, mirror just what was mentioned before, that we have to work on all levels and realize what we can change at which level. So to move to the next question, see the Green New Deal as a transition to a new kind of society. Yes, I think there are also people involved in Green New Deal work who are actually, who want that, who doesn't just want to save the current capitalist system in the sense of moving away from neoliberalism and reintroduce a new kind of green social democracy. So the problem is more whether it does that then, and it's become such a big discourse now that my point is this, that many of the core degrowth elements is not present in this debate. It doesn't mean that many of the suggestions cannot take us in the right direction. But I can also reflect a bit on a question that Ricardo asked me earlier about the other elements from in addition to work, which are important to bring this agenda forward. And I think, again, what is really missing in Green New Deal proposals is to dare to raise the debate about consumption levels, even though what is promised is kind of clean air, green water, public transport for everyone, it is never explicitly said that we are over-consuming, and we really need to address this, and we need to address how the overconsumption in the north is happening at the back of a large amount of people, mainly in the global south. And it also doesn't really address the limits of technology in this respect. So this is why I really feel that it's important to have or I fear that if we enter the Green Deal programs, that these really important core elements kind of get watered out in the name of pragmatism and so on. And I would rather suggest that we really uphold them as a social movement that emits public pressure on this ongoing process.
All right, thanks a lot, Tone, for that. And I'd like now to turn to Jagoda, again, for another question that was asked for the public from the audience, and I wanted to pick up with something that now Tone was saying now. So, speaking of overconsumption, which is something that, of course, is at the core of the growth research, and we said that the European Green Deal is very much predicated upon a green growth strategy. So they're trying to say that we can keep on expanding the economy while minimizing environmental impacts. And of course, this fantasy is predicated upon the theory, or rather the myth of decoupling. And in this respect, I want to point out a very good report that was published by the European Environmental Bureau just a few months ago, Decoupling Debunked, which I think is a very persuasive empirical demonstration of the limits to decoupling and how this is not a strategy for green growth, which is a myth. So I wanted to ask to you something about this issue of circularity in the economy and green growth, because I know that Friends of the Earth Europe works very much on reducing material consumption. And I wanted to hear from you, how do you see this understanding being widespread within EU decision makers? Like, are they still holding on to this green growth myth that we can grow the economy while reducing material consumption, or they start realizing that the game is up and we need to move on beyond this paradox, really?
Thanks. Well, I would say they're still in this decoupling stage, which is in a way first stage, like closing the circle and making it circle instead of linear, and everything gets back to waste sites, landfill sites, or incineration. They also focus much more on waste and to the lesser extent to other materials. Plastics, also decisions on single-use plastic were very welcomed, of course, and now they are kind of implemented also in other countries globally. So it's also, I think we should take into account that the European Union is also agenda-setting in policy. So what we influence here, it also sometimes gets to other places, so which is good. But definitely they are not talking about making circles smaller. And this is some of demands that we are saying in circular economy, and that's probably the first start to link it with the growth. You have to make this circle smaller and smaller. So maybe I just want to also say, for when we talk about European Union, and that's also what my campaigners and me debate, like we always think of monolith. That's not monolith, like Commission is not monolith. Commission is compromise between different parties. And therefore, you have people who maybe already understand what we are saying and they want to bring this agenda even further. And then you have those who are really strongly opposing. So in real life, when we are trying to make change, I think we have to take this into account. It's not just us and them. It's what they do, it's always a compromise. How strong we are in the streets, on all the levels, on national level, on European level, as a movement, that will influence more the outcome of that compromise. So I just want to reflect a bit on that, because we always say, oh no, they are not good enough and so on. Well, they're a result of the forces in Europe, right? If corporate forces and lobbyist forces are stronger than us, then of course we have worse results. Yes, I would say that it's a long road to get to real degrowth and real closing the circles. And maybe this decoupling can be the first step, but we should really move forward quite quickly.
Thanks, Jagoda. And I completely agree with what you're saying about moving beyond this vision of the European Commission and the institution as monolithic, and rather trying to be more strategic in our thinking of also exploiting the fractures within the establishment. And this is the way you can advance a new common sense. So I totally agree with you that we need to get past this very black and white vision about institutions. There was another poll that has just closed, and I wanted to read out the results since it has to do with governance and the role of municipal level in this transformation before going back to Powell once again. But unfortunately, I cannot see the results of the poll. So bear with me just 1 second. Because I cannot see the results, so they need to send it to me, but I can, well, okay, let's leave it for later because I don't want to stall the discussion. So I want to go back to Powell and ask you a question that is connected to what we have just discussed with Jagoda about theory of change. And so there was a question, quite a provocative one, coming from the audience. So I'd like to pose it to you. So the question was, assuming that politicians are intelligent people and do understand the issues at hand, but they are captured by lobbies, the question is, shouldn't we stop investing a huge amount of our collective energies on making a proposal for alternatives? Isn't that the job that politicians should do? Should we not rather focus more on building a bottom-up pressure to force the politicians to react to this people pressure? So the idea is, how do you build the people power? Because as Jagoda was saying, like, there are fractures within the establishment, and depending on the strength of the actors of the various powers, be it corporate powers or people powers, we can push certain factions to dominate over others. So the question is, how do we bring that pressure to bear on them?
Yeah, that's a vital question, and I fully agree with it. As I said before, the reason for the radicalism of the original New Deal, if you can call it radical, was precisely because there was bottom-up pressure exerted by labor unions, by activists, by various communities around the United States that forced a certain agenda onto the table that wouldn't have otherwise been there. And Europe is missing that right now. If you look at the climate movement, and this is something that worries me and infuriates me to no end, is that you have huge segments of activists who are, they're fighting the biggest political struggle of the past century, which is for climate justice, for a green transition, for a more sustainable society, and yet they maintain that they are non-political. And they refuse to engage with the mechanisms of political power. And so, you have countless examples throughout history, Occupy Wall Street being the most recent one, of people going out into the streets, people waving placards for 3 years, people having conversations in tents on public squares, and then people get bored, people need to go back to work, people need to make some money, and they just leave. And the biggest, I think, the biggest sign that we are not, as a movement, doing our job is that there hasn't been a backlash by the establishment, right? The fact that Germany could open a coal plant today, despite the fact that 2.5% of the German population went out to protest against climate inaction last summer, suggests that maybe just going out into the streets is not enough. Maybe just signaling your desire for something else isn't enough. You have to build power, and you have to build power through the various mechanisms that are already existing, whether that's organizing within your workplace, whether it's shutting down the economy, whether it's chaining yourself to a construction site to prevent the emergence of these things, or whether it's engaging seriously in electoral politics to bring leaders into office who actually care and whose agenda is actually radical enough. But that's not happening. You had a huge section of the climate movement, which isn't completely averse to electoral politics, which rallied behind the kind of neoliberal green parties of Europe, which isn't going to deliver the change we need either. So yeah, absolutely, power here is key, and I think the biggest challenge and the biggest test in the next years and in the next decade will be whether we can politicize the climate movement and push it towards concrete political demands and concrete political strategies and concrete ways of assuming power and clawing back power from the technocratic establishment, or if this movement goes the way of Occupy Wall Street and fizzles out and everything goes back to normal as it did after the financial crisis.
All right, great. Thanks, Pablo, for that. And we finally have the results of the poll about what is the level of governance we need to operate at in order to push the most transformative change. And municipal community level got 22% of the vote, the national level 16%, followed then by 1 digits by the EU level at the international level. But then the option that got the most votes was all of the above, 50%. So it seems like that the municipal level is seen as more prominent over the others, followed by the national level, but it's important that we operate at all this level of governance. All this being said, we just have 10 minutes left and still so many questions pouring in. It's been a deluge of questions, so thank you to our audience for engaging with this debate. But unfortunately, we cannot cover all of them. And given that we have so little time left, I would like to give each one of our panelists the opportunity for making their final remarks, starting with Tone.
Okay, thank you. In that case, I would like to just support what Paul just said and about the need for building power. And I think to come back to something which is one of the difficulties here then is that historically it was really trade unions and labor power which we have seen as being able to really mobilize strong movements in the way to take over political power. While at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, how can degrowth, which is not a movement that promises workers a bigger piece of the cake, but which is really discussing this kind of modernist material living standard and ways of living, find a way to engage with the labor movement. So I think this is really a core challenge and a core task that we need to take on. And I know there are other debates later today as well about that, so we should really move on to them. I also wanted to mention that we must remember that we are talking about organizing both modes of production, levels of productions, and relations of production in the degrowth mode, which was in the degrowth agenda, which were things that we didn't really discuss so much earlier. So I wanted to just mention that at the very end, and like to pick up on things we said earlier about the circular economy, for example, which is one of those very buzzwords used very loosely, not taking into account technological barriers and not taking into account that it takes a lot of energy to recycle materials, and that this is really important to point out when these solutions are being lifted all the time. And just to, at the very end, suggest some practical steps that could be suggested in whatever kind of policy we are discussing from a degrowth perspective, because often degrowers are taken to be too abstract or general or idealistic, but there are things which are very, very clear practical policies which can be implemented. And I think maybe the two most important ones I would mention is decommodification of a range of sectors, which also links a bit to working against austerity and neoliberalism, but going beyond that. So decommodifying health, decommodifying education, but also thinking about housing and food in this respect. And also to start discussing maximum income. It's a very concrete, practical step that we should really start to talk more about. So thank you for organizing this debate.
Thank you, Tone, for your great thinking around this. So, Jagoda, please.
Hello. I feel like I want to say 100 things more, but we have no time. So maybe just coming back to mobilizing. Numbers, people on the streets, it's important, but it's not enough. Yes, if you want to have more people, then people usually dilute the message to have more people and more participation, and then it's end up with not much. So this is lesson learned. So maybe we should move from mobilizing to organizing much more and be much more strategic where we put our efforts and how we actually inspire this, what I call catalysts in community, or whatever you call them, local leaders, that they can kind of multiply the efforts. So this is what I would suggest. In terms of solutions, I never propose that we should have all technical solutions ready-made, and we should not necessarily focus our energy into that. But what we have to have is vision, what we want to achieve, maybe some ideas how we want to achieve it. So like based on values that people can relate and understand. And then we can also use narrative, so people can again understand no matter what background there is. And this is what is motivating. And coming back to change and numbers, I've forgotten numbers, but there's social research on how many people actually you need to engage to bring change. And it's actually not that many numbers, but has to be really common goal that is easily understandable and that you can communicate. So let's get inspired with this kind of learnings from the past and other movements, and see how we can actually build a degrowth movement even more successful and more impactful.
Yes, the only kind of growth we want to see is the one of the degrowth movement, right?
Well, there is growth in Global South that maybe in some places still you want to have some kind of growth, huh?
Right, yes. We surely want to see flourishing, yes, of a qualitative kind, for sure, yes. All right, Pavel, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. So I'd like to actually wrap up by commenting on the results of the last poll, which I found very interesting. I know I've gone on and on about municipalism, but that's only because if you take the European Union as an example, the municipal level is really the only place where interesting and innovative and radical climate policy is being proposed. But actually, I think that the international level is the only level that really matters if we're talking about a holistic, global solution and response to climate change. The reason I think that is, if you look at a lot of the activism today, even the most successful activism, it kind of resembles a game of whack-a-mole, right? So you whack the fossil fuel industry in one country and it pops up in another country. You reduce emissions and vehicle production in Germany, and then Germany sells all of its highest polluting vehicles to Poland and Romania and Hungary and Eastern Europe at low rates. You increase wages in one country and production shifts to another country, and you have no cross-border bargaining power. So the real challenge, I think, to overcome this issue is to link these struggles together, to take the people in Mendoza, Argentina, who are fighting against fracking, not because they want a Green New Deal, but because they're suffering from cancer and their soil is poisoned, their water is poisoned by fracking, and connect them with activists in Barcelona, where Ricardo is, I think, right? Where the fracking is shipped to the port, and connect them with activists in Greece who are fighting against the opening of LNG terminals, so that collectively, on a planetary scale, we shut down those industries. Because doing so in one country alone isn't going to do that. So shameless plug, a couple of weeks ago, we launched a project called the Progressive International, whose mission is precisely to do that, to bring all of these different forces together in a kind of shared struggle. And the first bit of policy research we're doing is around the global Green New Deal as a response to the COVID pandemic. So I encourage you all to check it out. But thank you so much for having me. And it was really exciting and fun to talk to you all.
Thanks a lot, Pavel, for mentioning also the Progressive International, which is a very ambitious and timely project that has just been launched. So I want to wrap up here, and thanks all our great speakers and all the people who attended and flooded us with great questions. I hope that the debate was interesting, and we need to wrap up now. But the good question is that we can keep on discussing this on Discord. Well, it's day 2 of the conference, so I'm sure you are all familiar with how Discord works. So I encourage you to go on the platform and keep on getting good ideas flowing. And then I also want to point out that in 15 minutes time at 1:30 p.m. the Degrowth and European Politics workshop starts. The subtitle is Creating a Democratic and Caring Economy and Society that Serves the Many. It's limited to 30 people and based on first come, first serve. So I encourage you to log in as fast as possible. It will be a much more interactive discussion where where the organizers were trying to discuss some of the examples of bottom-up initiatives that are relevant for the growth. On this note, let's end our debate, and I thank all our speakers once again, and I wish you a good conference to all of you. Take care, bye.